Today is Tuesday, August 3rd. The year is 2021. This is No Easy Answers, and I'm your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Well, thank you for tuning in from wherever you happen to be listening. My name is Jules Taylor. This is No Easy Answers, and I am delighted to have you with us for today's episode. No Easy Answers is a podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition, and we are 100% listener supported. So if you like what we do and you want to support the show, we'd love to have you visit our Patreon page, where subscribers receive some of our content and interviews in advance. In addition to receiving our content before it's posted to the mainstream, I also post chess videos that nobody asked for. And to be clear, I don't know if any of our patrons play chess. I don't even know if they like chess. I just know that I play chess, and I am what I consider to be a decently skilled chess player. I mean, during the pandemic, I really got back into the game and brushed up on a lot of theory. Yes, chess has its own theory. It's its own nerdy thing that I really enjoy. But you know, you can enjoy this nerdy pastime with me by heading to our Patreon, where we now have 2 hours of chess content, and I plan on adding a lot more. Also, if you check the show notes, we have links to our Reddit, our Twitter, our Discord, our YouTube, and we love it when listeners reach out and engage with the show. We appreciate all the reviews in Apple Podcasts and Audible. You know that every time someone leaves a 5-star review or a few positive words, it sets the algorithms in motion and it brings new listeners to the show. So please consider taking a moment to click on the review button in your podcast host. That really helps us. Alright, so today on the show we have part 2 of our ongoing crossover with the boys over at Acid Horizon, one of my favorite podcasts. Today we have a conversation that I recorded a few weeks ago with Craig and Daniel Barker. Listeners might remember Daniel from episode 19, titled, "Is Psychology a Pseudoscience?" Daniel is a practicing psychoanalyst who recently made an appearance on Acid Horizon, and so I thought it would be cool to include him in on this conversation about music and philosophy. This conversation, like the last one, was really informal and off the cuff. For our listeners in the audience who are musicians, I think you'll really dig this episode. All three of us are musicians and music nerds, so for non-musicians, I think this conversation might seem a little bit insider baseball, but if you stick with it, we do end up speaking about Nietzsche, a little bit of Deleuze and Guattari, and you know, sprinkled in there are some stories about music gigs we've done through the years. This conversation is more like three friends just shooting the shit, and so it's a light conversation and probably a much needed contrast to the directions this podcast was taking. I mean, after 6 episodes on fascism, I think it's a good thing to have a couple of episodes that aren't so dark. So I appreciate Craig and Daniel hanging with me. You know, episodes with Will and Adam, the other 2 co-hosts of Acid Horizon, are in the works now. So please enjoy this conversation featuring Craig from Acid Horizon and the stranger, Daniel Barker. Welcome to No Easy Answers. My name is Jules Taylor, and I am joined by 2 esteemed colleagues in the podcast world today. We have Craig from Acid Horizon. You might remember him from the last episode, part 1 of this ongoing series where we have some free-form, sort of lighthearted for the most part, conversations about music that probably dip into some philosophy. It's hard to avoid all of that. I'm sitting here with the stranger. You might remember him from a recent episode of Acid Horizon. And anyway, so we're here admiring each other's t-shirts at this point, and I'm the only guy not wearing Crit Drip paraphernalia at this point. So
you'll get there.
Yeah, I was saying the Schopenhauer t-shirt. You know, I noticed that, some of those shirts like there's hey, 8 people have this in their basket right now. And poor Schopenhauer is sitting there with nobody having him on reserve, man. Yeah. So it's befitting, though.
It is.
That's right.
It mirrors how no one went to his lecture and everyone went to Hegel, right? That fun little fact everyone knows. you know.
And he was a bit of a curmudgeon anyway, so he deserves it at this point.
Yeah, he would prefer no one have his shirt in their basket, I think.
He might push you down a flight of stairs or something if he saw his visage on your shirt.
Precisely.
Wasn't there like a saying he had at some point that was like, so, because he's known as the philosopher of pessimism, so like he said something like, in as far as the universe is like a cruel place or something, like I am that much more to being correct, or that much more to being closer to the way things actually are. I think I remember him saying something to that end.
I wouldn't doubt it.
Sounds like something he would say. Yeah.
Right. So the last time Craig and I were here, we talked about music and gear, and I think we talked a little bit about your pedals, Craig. But like, I don't think that part was contained in the conversation when we started recording. But like just before this, you were what were you singing in that video that you posted to Twitter right before you joined them?
Well, I have an 80s gig that has been booked now for next month. So I have to shed all these tunes that probably like 36 songs typically in one night. Well, actually for this gig, maybe not as many, maybe something on the order of like 28. But it's been like a year since, I mean, these tunes are just in your bones. These are the songs that you hear in the supermarket, on the radio. I think I was singing Bonnie Tyler's Total Eclipse of the Heart. And so
Nice.
just at home, like, I like singing women's songs. I mean, particularly because it's in a higher register, so it's a little bit more challenging. You develop your chops a little bit more. Man, that's just an intense tune. I mean, it's something it's kind of a cultural meme, something that's been made fun of in movies. I forget which movie it is where, I don't know. It's almost like a wedding singer kind of movie, but yeah, I mean, it has a sort of campiness to it, but like once you get behind the mic with that song, and if you can pull it off, it's like, it's a pretty serious song, like in terms of songwriting.
It's a power ballad. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very, like, you would see it played over B-roll in like a rom-com or something. And at the same time, very powerful, well-written song. That's like most 80s music. I actually have a little bit about 80s music in my blog, where I grew up thinking it was trash because my dad always talked poorly about it. And then I actually really started listening to 80s music, and I was like, 80s music is some of the best music ever written. Like, so layered, so many instruments. They were experimenting with the new technology, all that kind of stuff. Interesting. If you listen to the superficial stuff, it sounds plain and boring and minimalistic. If you really listen in, you're like, there's a lot going on in all these songs.
Yeah, and not only that, it was kind of a heyday for recording, because it was really the height of analog recording.
Right.
And I mean, not only that, just the pop stars that came out at that time. You had Michael Jackson, Prince, Cyndi Lauper, Duran Duran, not to mention all the hair metal and everything else that came out, and all the underground music too. And it's funny, I was talking to Jules about this last time, but I do, for some of the musical stuff that I do an 80s cover band and a 90s cover band. And, some of these shows, I'm playing to 1,500 or 2,000 people at a Vegas venue or something like that. And there's a very distinct difference between the sort of character of the music and even the character of the nostalgia between the 80s and the 90s. There's a way in which I think the 90s music was deeper and it was more diverse, and it took us in different directions. I mean, there's a sort of collective brooding that happens in the 90s too, that doesn't really translate into like an entertaining live show. I mean, not to say that there isn't songs, but there certainly aren't as many. And I think in a way it's kind of harder to put together a cohesive sort of 90s pastiche of tunes. Whereas like with the 80s stuff, like it's all just like hit after hit, and everybody's loving it. Yeah. Right.
90s makes me think of Britney Spears, even though she was really 2000s, but it's like mid to late 90s is like the time where it's like the instrumentals are just like a backdrop that's played through the PA, and then there's like the front girl. Then it also makes me think of bands like Korn, Slipknot, Nine Inch Nails, Nirvana, which are aggressive. And the stage performance is actually hostile to the crowd in a way.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, man. You know, the 80s thing, man, it's like towards the beginning of that decade, digital reverbs came out and they were really expensive. And I feel like every studio had to have them. And because you had this really expensive unit sitting there, you had to use it and people wanted to hear it. And so you ended up with these huge sounding toms and, you know, drenched wet vocals. And I mean, it's really something, man. Like like some of the things from the 80s that I like those sort of Bryan Adams Run to You kind of guitar tones that happened in the 80s, the Def Leppard Hysteria kind of chorus sound, like some of that stuff is really like it's close to home in a way that like I've tried to adopt it on a pedal board no matter when I've had one. And so I mean, 80s music, I grew up in the 80s as like I was born in 83. So it was kind of the decade that, you know, like yourself, dude, like I ended up like not liking it for a long time. And when I finally came around to it, I was like, these are huge choruses, you know, these are such well-written tunes. Man, 80s stuff is, it's kind of a guilty pleasure at times. Like Craig inspired me to listen to some Journey a while back, and
I got into Journey, hard. They're
man.
They're better than just the one-hit wonders you hear that everyone memes. Like, crap, I forget the name of the song. It's the funniest music video. It's kind of like the heavy metal Journey song, Separate Ways. You know?
Yeah.
The first time that came on, my girlfriend and I were in the cafeteria in college, and we were just laughing at like the drama of the song. And then we looked at the music video later. Have you seen that music video? You have to link to it. It's so melodramatic and 80s and fun, and it's also a really good song. So
like if there's one scene from the video that just captures the essence of that song and video, it's the keyboard player miming the little arpeggio, and then the keyboard just appears. And there's always, you know, of course, there's the slight shift in camera angle where they didn't do it quite right.
It's like a Tim and Eric skit almost.
Absolutely, yeah.
The drum fill in that song, I mime it every time I'm in the car. It's sick drum fill. It's a great song.
Oh no, yeah. Journey's awesome. It gets a huge reaction every time. I mean, of course, we play. You know, Don't Stop Believing, but there's other great stuff like, you know, Separate Ways, Any Way You Want It, like all that stuff just goes over well live.
I just want to say that I had this friend who was a woman and would make jokes about this. So I'm sure she wouldn't, as long as I say her name, she wouldn't mind me telling the story. But she had the worst tattoo. She claimed to have the worst tattoo anyway that she'd ever seen, and so and it turns out like over the years she wouldn't tell me like where it was. She just promised me it was the worst tattoo that I had ever seen. And one day she lets it slip. She's like, "Yeah, it's on my lower back, and it's the Journey logo with big cursive writing that says Don't Stop Believing." and so I thought it was kind of you know, how really, you know. And so anyway, she would make sort of self-deprecating jokes about that tattoo. And this is one time she mentioned, she was like, "Yeah, you know, it's like if I'm on all fours and the guy's feeling a little uninspired, or, you know, if I'm on my back and he's feeling uninspired, it's like, don't worry, there's a motivational message on the other side of me." You know? Anyway, but well, fucking A, man. The Stranger. It's been a little while since I've talked to you, man. We did that Is Psychotherapy a Pseudoscience episode, and and that was really positively received, you know. And you know, my partner's a mental health counselor. She actually just took this final exam today and passed it, so she's attempting to celebrate that as much as she can. You know, it's kind of weird when you work long term towards the goal and then it happens and then you're just kind of in shock, you know. So last time we talked, we were on the show, and since then, you know, other things have, you know, more things have read and things like that. And the other day, and I want to tell you about some of the Nietzsche stuff that I've been thinking lately. But first, I've never actually gotten a chance to talk to you about music, man. Like, what do you do, or what's going on with you in music?
Yeah, I love music. I was into music before I was into psychology and philosophy. I grew up around a ton of instruments and, got hand-me-down instruments. So I grew up listening to like Pink Floyd and like Steely Dan and, all that kind of stuff. Blue Oyster Cult, was the first song I learned on guitar. Don't Fear the Reaper. And then, Ozzy, I got into metal, blah, blah, blah. I got into all the metal and stuff. But I played in several bands. I don't talk about where I live, but all around the states that I live, I played in different kinds of bands and, played in metalcore bands, deathcore bands. I kind of grew up in the era of like death metal, hardcore. I ended up the only friend I made out of college was this super cool kid who was just super into music, knew way more about it than me. And she was a drummer and did synth and modular synth. So we started a band and we played a lot of dingy dive bars and a lot of like, for lack of a better term, like drug den, like sketchy, am I going to get killed here houses? And, we played, I don't want to say too much because I don't want people to try to find my old band, but we would set up an entire band's worth of equipment with just us two. And I would play through like 3 or 4 amps and she would play the drums and we would both do vocals and we would just play like the shittiest venues with like the weirdest bands. We'd always get up, on the bill that we don't belong on. And, people would be like, who the hell? People would always be like, who are these two nuts setting up like 4 people's worth of equipment? Why have they only played one note? We were drone, grindcore kind of spacey.
Yeah, man.
My friend, she would always call us Jerome's Dream Pop. If you guys know Jerome's Dream, there's like this whole, or like bands like The Body. If you guys listen to The Body,
there's a band I'm familiar with that sounds kind of like what you do called Friendship Commanders, out of Nashville. It's Jerry Rowe and Buick Audra, and they're that kind of heavy sort of 2-person brute force sort of method, which is wonderful. And their last record, they had Steve Albini produce it, which was
nice.
Which is super cool. But that if I'm hearing you right, that's kind of what it sounds like, man.
Yeah.
Like 3 or 4 different amps and a drummer just fucking killing it, kind of thing.
Yeah. Like a combination of like Sun O and then like some weird spazzy kind of grindcore stuff and clean parts. Though I love Pink Floyd, so I was bringing kind of like the bluesy kind of psychedelic clean stuff. And so Sweet. I just had a lot of fun playing and blew out my back basically and had to go to physical therapy and then damaged my hearing and now I have tinnitus, but all kind of worth it. So
hey, did you know that Steve Albini follows our podcast? Does he follow your podcast?
What?
We're mutuals. One day I was scrolling through my Twitter. Yeah. I'm like, Steve, he follows me. Why?
Yeah.
So
and I'm looking at his Twitter right now. He's following 151 people.
Oh,
and
wow.
he has 470 some followers. And I actually reached out to him. I'm like, it was very early on in the development of our podcast. We probably had like 3 or 4 episodes out. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, oh, hey. And, I guess I had like a little bit of a starstruck moment. I said, hey, big fan. I'd love to hear your feedback on the pod. And he didn't really respond to me. He just kind of stood back there, which is very Steve Albini, at least in terms of the stories that I've heard. So, but I think he's very, very much into theory. I get a sense that he might be listening.
I think he is a cult, there's like this crossover between kind of weird occult theory and then music, like Urbanomic does a lot of stuff on that. Like Code 9 was part of the CCRU. Right. I got a book back there. It's called Audent. It's like a CCRU kind of variant, like collective of weird musicians, and they write on music research and sonic warfare. But, it's all kind of like hyperstitional, so it's all weird. But I've always imagined in my head that Steve Albini somewhere is like one of those guys who writes anonymously. So that's kind of like my fantasy. I have no information to back that up, but it seems like it'd be true. So maybe it's true now.
The last I heard, he was doing his own project that I guess, I forget the name of it, but something that he had done for a while, and I should know the name of it. But I'm looking at his Twitter right now, and he hasn't really posted in, like, I don't know, 11 months or something. But he, like, all of his posts are pretty anti-establishment. He's like a huge punk guy.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, the albums that dude has cut are just amazing. In Utero and, gosh, you know, just to name it one.
Totally. I actually knew only a few of them, and then I went on his wiki and just was like, it's like a 10-minute list.
Yeah.
Some interesting stuff in there. I think he even did some Suno and basically anything experimental, off kilter, you know, extreme and fun.
Yeah,
I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I think he was in a Tape Op magazine a long time ago. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that publication, but
yeah, I am.
Yeah, cool. So he was in a Tape Op or something, and I think I remember him saying, like, I make X amount of money per hour, and that's how I bill every band. And
that's punk.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, even that was back before, like, I think I even had a sense of, like, you know, economics or Marx or whatever. So, like, reading that at that time was like, wow, that's really hardcore. It's you know.
Do you mean like he was taking a low salary, more or less, like even for big bands?
Yeah,
Okay.
Like he was just charging the same amount, no matter who it was, you know, just like, per hour kind of thing.
Whether it's Nirvana or some garage band off the street, it's like X dollars an hour. That's pretty admirable. I don't know if that's what Jules is saying. I think that's cool. Yeah.
Something close to that, yeah. So pretty wild stuff, man. So fucking hey, Steve Albini in conversation. I know it would go there. Yeah, man. So you know, man, as far as music is concerned, I mean, just to sort of tell you guys what I've been doing with music in the last few years, like, you know, I moved up to Woodstock from Nashville. And when I was in Nashville, the last thing I was doing there was just teaching music production. I was teaching a lot of like Logic 9 or 10 and Reason version 5 around then, the Pro Tools courses and some studio, like in studio stuff with students. And that was all fun and good. I had a home studio and I moved to Woodstock because I knew this girl in Woodstock and she was from I knew this girl in Nashville that was from Woodstock. I traveled with her. And when things dissolved up here, it was like, man, I've worked on a lot of other people's records, but like, why haven't I worked on my own? So I ended up, you know, taking some equipment that I had and like, that was like like some preamps and converters and stuff and thinking like, man, I should sell this and get some studio time and really commit down towards like getting something done within X amount of time. And so I ended up making my last album in 2018 called Mountain Time. And I pretty much like played every instrument except for drums and bass on there. So there's like some piano and a lot of guitar, but there's some dobro and lap steel, a little bit of mandolin. And so, but yeah, I mean, as far as like what I do with music actively, like I perform out, not quite as often now that COVID's not. I think I'm playing this week on Friday, but like I played one other gig this summer, whereas last summer I was out maybe half a dozen times, and before that, I had every weekend booked, you know? So, and it's mostly like original stuff. It's mostly stuff that I've written. There's a few covers sprinkled in there, and I usually play out with a pedal steel player, and it's a cool pedal steel because he plays it's a single neck pedal steel that plays in a universal tuning, so he can he can. It's in E9, but he can, with a single pedal, go to B6, which is like one step away from like C6, doing that sort of Memphis over to Hawaii sort of open tuning. So it's like if I'm playing, you know, a waltz or something, he can hit all those like old country sounds, but he can also get kind of a modern pedal steel sound out of the E9 tuning. Yeah, it's
E9 like a E9th chord, like basically E, B, F sharp.
I believe that's what it is. Yeah.
Perfect chord. You know, that's the Welcome to the Machine chord. One of my favorite chords of all time. So that's really cool. You sent me a link to your stuff a long time ago and I favorited it. I've been meaning to get around and listen to it. But I saw a really cool picture of you on Twitter and someone was like, this is how a front man should look, and this band was so good, and I was like, that's pretty cool. You're getting some recognition. So
yeah, it's nice when that happens, you know. I mean, it's funny, some of the remarks, like, this guy looks like a front man should.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, what is that? It's
what does
kind of
that
funny.
mean?
Yeah, what does that mean? Seriously. So Craig, how do you feel about talking some Nietzsche, man? I think did you guys do an episode on like the genealogy of morals or something?
Yes, we did. So as far as Nietzsche goes, that's what's on my mind right now, that aspect of Nietzsche. But yeah, well, we can talk about, I mean, it was interesting because I saw you had mentioned something on Twitter, maybe it was to the stranger, I can't remember, but you know, you had said there was a worry about Nietzsche, that, you know, he was proto-fascist. And I mean, which isn't an uncommon sort of criticism or a line that you hear. And I mean, like, if there's a place to start that discussion and knowing that's what might be on your mind, I'm curious where you get that.
Well, let me frame it then. I'm glad you're right on point with that. Sounds like you just like stabbed your cat in the background. It's awesome.
Oh no, he's going to be in here. So, yeah.
Great.
So there will be
cats.
cat noises.
Excellent.
That's a good movie.
There will be cat noises.
That's a terrible joke. Cut that out later. Daniel Day-Lewis plays a cat. His best role yet.
Give me the treats.
Yeah. Oh, jeez.
Oh, shit. All right, so let me frame this, man. So I had a recent conversation with Professor Gabriel Rockhill, and I've also been watching some lectures by Professor, I believe if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, it's Taimur Rahman. That's Taimur Ramnan.
Okay.
So I've been watching some of his lectures, and then I had a conversation with Dr. Rockhill, and you know, he started to point to things about the CIA using Foucault, like sort of, and it wasn't so much the CIA targeting that was like in any way fracturing to some of my enchantment with theory or philosophy in general. But so in watching Taimur Rahman's lectures about fascism, he really points to a lot of things that Nietzsche said, and so a lot of those points are like, okay, they're points that I've heard. I can understand the argument. Not too unsettling to this overall enchantment. You know, I just got through a couple episodes on like Heidegger and Schmidt, so like I am in the practice of like deriving things that are useful from, you know, authors that we shouldn't like, you know, take as any more influence than what is necessary, you know, with Heidegger being a Nazi, with the same thing with Carl Schmitt. So all of that in mind, and all of that to say is I've read some of the Genealogy of Morals recently, and the other night I found you can find audiobooks as podcasts, so I entered in like The Antichrist by Nietzsche, which is said to be like it's his autobiography at the end of his life, where most of his views are probably most salient. And you know, the first thing that he says within that text is, you know, look me in the face, you know, and he says, we are Hyperboreans. Now, the concept of Hyperborea is something that was in Greek mythology. It was a place in the north where a pale-complected people once lived, and they came to the south at some point. And I think some of that is, maybe you could look at that in history somewhere. I'm not really sure. But the point is that during the research about fascism, I found that a lot of the mythology of the Aryan race had to do with people like Julius Evola and Robert Charroux, basically mythologizing Hyperborea into a sort of Aryan white supremacist concept of like pale-complected people in the global north that succumbed to the evils of the global south, that they were Nordic and Scandinavian looking, that they and the Aryan race was said to come from Hyperborea in the sort of mythology of all of that. So when you read Nietzsche, and obviously he's a fantastic writer, and obviously it's something that you can get really enthralled in, and certainly there that we could talk about more concepts than just like the Antichrist, right? But it wasn't so much all those other little things. Maybe it was the look me in the face, we are Hyperboreans, that sort of was the straw that maybe broke this camel's back, that has me feeling a little bit disenchanted with theory in general, like, you know, further out than just, hey, Nietzsche is a proto-fascist in this conversation. You know, is that true? Is that not true? What can we take from Nietzsche that is positive, that will enhance our way in the world? And what do we leave behind? More so than that, there's also like, this has been really like, it's got me wanting to put down some of the more higher theory text and pick back up stuff like Stalin and Lenin again, to revisit those texts, or read something maybe a little more Marxist academic, like a Domenico Lacerdo sort of text, you know. So that's what I would say, and I would say that, I think the stranger had mentioned something on Twitter about how he thought that might be like an obtuse reading, and I'm not inclined to disagree at all. I just want to say that I want to ask two things of you guys in this conversation. Is one, like, restore my sort of faith that we can, that these, as much as one is possible through a single conversation, attempt at restoring my sort of faith in this theoretical sort of dark space I've entered, where I'm a little bit up to here with it, and starting to rethink some things based upon maybe a single sentence. Maybe it's a little absurd, whatever. But two, I want to be permissive for you guys to, like, if I am wrong, man, like, tell me that I am wrong, so I just want to be permissive of, like, wherever this conversation needs to go around this, I'm totally open to it. So,
well, I mean, I would probably begin by just sharing what I think are my limitations in addressing the question. I would be out of my depth a little bit to comment on some of the Greek mythology and, some of the other sorts of mythology that Nietzsche invokes, just because that's not a very strong research area for me. But my question would be, as best as we can, taking the text on its face, and then also, after looking at the text, how could we compare that to, let's say, a definition for fascism, right? Because what we would want then, to determine whether or not Nietzsche was either fascist or proto-fascist or what have you, is that something about his text indexes to whatever criteria we ascribe to fascism, right?
Right.
And that's one of the challenges to begin with. And I know last time you talked about Umberto Eco, and I know there's that, it's been like for 10 or 15 years circulating on the internet, that list of 10 characteristics of fascism,
sure.
Which, you know what I mean? Like, and that's just one person's take on it. There's actually an excellent book, by Anthony Paxton, I believe. I don't know if you've read this book, and hold on. I just want to,
sure.
Let me pull it up here because, The Anatomy of Fascism. I'm sorry, not Anthony Paxton. Robert O. Paxton. Yeah, and it's called The Anatomy of Fascism. And I think the definition of fascism that he puts forward, I mean, at least from a historical standpoint, maybe, like, I mean, I might look, to Deleuze and Guattari to get like a full-fledged definition of what fascism is and all the implications within the word. But just from a historical standpoint, I think Paxton has a good take, which is, it doesn't, the term fascism doesn't necessarily demark a specific or a very definite set of characteristics, but a host of tendencies that sort of project through different cultures and nationalities and so forth. And I think there would be some overlap between Umberto Eco and Paxton, and even to some extent Deleuze and Guattari. And I mean, right off the bat, the thing that Nietzsche is not going to be about is the kind of national collectivism that's involved with fascism, right?
Sure.
That's, and I think that would be like, for me, in my definition of fascism, my working definition of fascism, that rate's pretty high,
right?
Having a, a sort of even if some aspects of it are amorphous, talking about the sort of nationalistic component, the racial component, and how those the corporate component, as it were, how the idea of the nation and the race sort of maps onto economic relations within a given locality, and how those localities interact with one another. I mean, of course, right now I'm talking about 20th century fascism, right? But then, after World War II and the collapse of those fascisms, then I mean, I'm open to the idea of entertaining a broader definition of fascism, like how has it evolved? How have these tendencies sort of nested in other forms of politics? To what extent does liberalism beget fascism, right? As they say.
Yeah,
so, I
man.
mean, so there's all kinds of, there's all kinds of ways to go with it. And I mean, I'll let the stranger talk for a little bit on it. But I think, for Nietzsche, one of the things Nietzsche is going to rail against is the idea of a kind of, national or even racial sovereign identity, like an idea of supremacy that's pegged to the state would just absolutely be a non-starter for him. So,
Sure.
I don't know. Maybe the stranger would like to hop on that.
I think you touch on a lot of what I would say. A few quotes that stick with me from Nietzsche jump into my mind. He says, and thus spoke Zarathustra, I highly mistrust all who the impulse is great to punish.
Right.
And then elsewhere in Will to Power, which is his most misused text, as we know, he says something like, powerful leadership is good if it weren't for the case that all who lead are stupid, or something like that. And it's basically, and then in the bigger picture of Nietzsche, his whole tone is one of understanding and empathy and sympathy, I would actually say. His whole railing against theology and replacing it with a psychology of the body is really to find explanations for phenomenon and the forces that lead to them, rather than to just label something good or bad. So religion comes in and says, murder's a sin. Well, that's really functional if we are starting a society and we don't want to kill each other and we want to start working together. But then society gets pretty big and, murder is a sin doesn't really work anymore. We want to understand what would make someone murder someone. And then that involves exploring some of the dark parts of the psyche and of human behavior without necessarily advocating for it. So I think I read a lot of Nietzsche. There's a lot of passages where he's like, you disgust me and you're vile and I hate you. And also I understand why you're like that. And I, in a way, love you for being that way. I think Nietzsche's whole tone is you can be disgusting and vile. You just have to own it and know that it's a part in a process. And there's no real goal. It's just constant overcoming. And then, like Craig said, he's against nationalism. He's against the state. He's even against authorial continuity. He has some nice sentence in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that's what good are holding your opinions your whole life? The experiences that gave me my opinions 10 years ago died 10 years ago. Now I'm, the person I am now, I might have different opinions. And that's true for his writing where, he went mad. And here's what I think people latch onto with fascism. I mean, he was German. The Nazis used his work. And he speaks from a tone of mania in most of his writing. He speaks from a grand place of elitism. And that reads, if you're not reading it humorous, it reads like you're being kind of attacked a little. But in the big picture, he's a philosopher of friendship. I read him as he talks about friends who should be like enemies. He's not about annihilating people, killing people, about, fascism for me is all about superego. There's a strict good and a strict bad, and it's all about debt. Nietzsche's probably the most anti-debt theorist out there besides maybe Marx, but the Germans believed they were owed this land because they were a good people by nature, and then Jews were bad people by nature.
That's right.
There's so much resentment in there. So I do also see where you could come from the place of his work gets used by right-wing people because it has this kind of, if you read it this way, might is right kind of hammer, like Greek mythology type stuff. But I like to read Nietzsche as he'd be a really good friend. So
yeah, and not to mention, I mean, he was specifically critical of anti-Semitism, not only in his text but in his relationships in his personal life.
Yeah,
I mean, his sister was the one who was responsible, like the stranger alluded to, picking up the will to power and repurposing it, towards these fascist ends. And she married somebody who was an unabashed anti-Semite.
Yeah.
But maybe to say, why might Nietzsche, appeal to fascists? Paxton points something interesting out, and he doesn't make this connection in the book. I'm kind of doing it on the fly here. We could, if we read Nietzsche as a vitalist, right, there's a way in which Nietzsche's relationship to philosophy changes or is very different from his predecessors in a way that, we talked about privileging the body, and maybe even eliminating this mind-body distinction in some sense, sort of using philosophy as a way to enliven and inhabit the body in some way. And what Paxton points out is that one of the tendencies of fascists was to be anti-ideological in some sense, right? Not to put forward arguments, not to create sophisticated theoretical systems, but to sort of invoke this sort of collective will, this energy and dynamic nationalistic collective spirit that was in some ways opposed to maybe the sort of ideological opponents of fascism, in the form of liberalism, in the form of communism and so forth, which are very much known for their books, their ideas and so forth. And like I said, I'm a little bit out of my depth there, but I know that was a big feature of the book.
Anti-intellectualism is big for fascism. And
yeah, that's right.
Nietzsche is an anti-intellectual as much as he is a high intellectual.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm. All right, so just some thoughts on all that stuff. So, obviously, I know I'm not trying to say that obviously that Nietzsche is a fascist because he died in 1900 or 1899 or something. So he came before all that, World War II, the interwar period. But I would say, as far as there are certain things about Nietzsche. Maybe I'll start with the concept of the Overman or the Übermensch, and of course that was probably appropriated by the fascist and much, to his sister probably helped with that. But I take a look at World War II and I wonder maybe if we could stop World War II right before news of the concentration camps came. I think that if Nietzsche could have lived to see his philosophies, his philosophy of the Übermensch and maybe some pro-eugenics tendencies that I'm not certain that he had, but it seems like in keeping with the time. It feels like Nietzsche may not have been, upset to have seen his philosophy referenced or inspired to take towards action and the developing of of the ideal race or something to that end. Maybe that would have been in line with some of Nietzsche's thoughts as far as the Übermensch concept that he has. And the other thing is the slave morality that he talks about, where he blames that probably on Christianity, as providing this sort of, this lesser sort of way of being in the world when we could be so much more, and it coincides with the Übermensch stuff. But I just wonder if all of that, the wanting to eliminate slave morality and then the concept of the Overman, that just gets me to a point where I think of course these ideas were adopted, and maybe if his sister wasn't even a part of this situation, maybe they would have been adopted anyway. It kind of fits in line with the direction of history in the 1930s. So I don't know which one of you guys wants to take that.
Stranger, you want to hit that one first? I mean, I have something to say, but go for it.
I'll say, slave morality is just a concept that's supposed to describe really a psychological process and like a behavioral process. That's the way I read it, where here's a different way of looking at it. The psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion said, the baby is the most powerful creature in the household because it really has no strengths. It's all weaknesses, but every stronger creature in the household has to stop what it's doing to take care of it. No one's going to kill a baby unless you're really off your rocker and mad. So that is like a working definition of slave morality. Nietzsche would actually say, it's okay to do that when you're a baby, but when culture allows people to flip their weaknesses into strengths, and then everyone else has to kind of play the game by that rules, it doesn't end up being good for a group of people, which I think, there's no real way to measure that. But I think it's an interesting critique of how power works in that, and it's almost Zizekian. Like, say I walk down the street and then someone bumps shoulders with me. Well, they're being just physically aggressive enough to irritate me, but not so physically aggressive that I'm justified in throwing them a punch. So that's slave morality. Slave morality are these little ways that people turn their weaknesses into strengths and then leverage it, and it's not good for them or others. Like slave morality is like identifying with a sickness. We don't have to reify like psychiatric discourse, but if you're like struggling with like a mental illness and then that becomes part of your identity, which we see a lot on social media, there's a lot of like secondary gains to that. Nietzsche would critique that. So I view slave morality as that dynamic, just using weakness for strength. Now, the other bit, I think Nietzsche talks a lot about, people who misuse his work. Like in Zarathustra, he's always talking about like, there are people who talk about loving life, but they don't really love life. This is why they look like they're using my stuff, but they're doing things a little bit different. I think the cool thing about Nietzsche is he almost doesn't like anything. He's such a contrarian that I think like he's almost safe to read because you're almost like, yeah, he wouldn't agree with anything. He's a narcissist, he only believes like what he wrote is good. And that's kind of what I love about him. Would he be happy with the way World War II went, the concentration camps? I don't think so. I view his thing is all about healthy competition. So I guess he's a little capitalist in that way. But, I think he would say about the concentration camp something sly and kind of provocative, like, well, they should really like level the planes and give the Jews guns and then see what happens. Like he would have some witty kind of weird aphorism about how both people should fight, right. It should be an even fight or something like that, even though he doesn't believe in equality. I think that's what we're dancing around. That's also feeds into the fascist bit is he is a very anti, egalitarianist.
Thinker. Exactly.
So I guess that was a little scattered, but
no, but I mean, I'm glad you brought up the anti-egalitarianism part. I also so part of the studies on fascism, I came across traditionalism, which I had no idea was a thing. I didn't know anything about that shit before I started researching this. And in some ways, it's more depraved than fascism itself. But the thing that characterizes traditionalists or radical traditionalists is a sort of anti-modernity or a scorn for modernity and a disbelief in the narrative of process. The disbelief in the narrative of progress. And so, once I started to see the sort of Hyperborean thing pop up in the Antichrist, his last work, there was also this passage, and it's just like 2 paragraphs long, but it's like, I don't even know if all of it's relevant, because I just remember hearing a bit of it, and I seem to have located it here. But it's like mankind does not represent a development of the better or the stronger or the higher in the way that it is believed today. Progress, in quotes, is merely a modern idea, that is to say, a false idea. The European of today is far less valuable than the European of the Renaissance. Onward development is not by any means by necessity and the same thing as elevation, advance, strengthening. In another sense, there are cases of individual success constantly appearing in the most various parts of the earth and from the most various cultures in which a higher type does manifest itself, something which in relation to collective mankind is sort of a superman. Such chance occurrence of great success have always been possible and perhaps always will be possible, and even entire races, tribes, nations can under certain circumstances represent such a lucky hit. So I just mean to point that out in the way that, like, he shares the number one thing that Umberto Eco listed in, or fascism, traditionalism, or it's actually number two, it's traditionalism, but he's pointing to like this anti-modernity, a disbelief in the narrative of progress, and I just find that kind of in line with the stuff at very early on, like before the 30s, at this point. So these types of things, and I know it's, I'm bringing this conversation to you after reading a little bit of one book from Nietzsche recently, and of course I've read Nietzsche throughout the years, and I think there are, in the past I've had some really great, engagement with Nietzsche and felt like his philosophy had enhanced kind of the way I led my life, even his concept of like, the camel when you're young and you carry stuff, and then you get to the point where you're a lion and you're refusing stuff, and then you turn to a baby saying yes, like all that stuff has been really like aphoristically wonderful, much like his writing, so, and it's only recently that I've started to know these things, and this is the first I've had any sort of talks on Nietzsche where I've been able to say these ideas. So I appreciate you guys listening to them, even if I'm totally wrong and he's not a proto-fascist or what have you. But I just thought that, it would be interesting to bring these sort of things up, because this has been floating around in the back of my head for a few days now.
Yeah. And mine as well, doing this episode. I think I'm trying to, make the case for Nietzsche in view of what we just looked at. I mean, what we looked at on our podcast, that is, talking about the anti-modernity piece. I think, like when you're reading the genealogy of morals, for example, that second essay, and thinking about the way in which Nietzsche valorized the Greeks over and above, Judeo-Christian traditions. I tend to think about that from a psychological point of view, and this is probably something not unfamiliar to Freud and Jung and other psychoanalysts too, in the way that the Greeks, for example, were able to live their lives. I mean, and I'm thinking here about the birth of tragedy too, in a way that was able to comprise not only pleasure, but pain and suffering, to, take in the totality of life, and the way that they use the pantheon of their gods as a way to express the sort of multiplicity of drives that we have as human beings. In Nietzsche's view, once we get to the monotheisms, Judeo-Christianity, for example, you have this, sort of split between pain and suffering, where, there's a sort of earthly pleasure that is meant to be, basically, it's a denial of life, a denial of vitality in the here and now, in our present, and an incessant deferment of pleasure that is said to come in the afterlife, right? And it comes through the creation of this creditor-debtor relationship, right? And the institution of debt, and the institution of the state and the church, and all of these institutions that displace us from the immediacy and the vitality of our existence. And, like when you look at, for example, just to sort of bring back the psychological piece, I'm thinking about the work of Freud and Jung, who actively incorporated mythology, Greek mythology. I mean, in some sense, Freud is just as great as Jung in this sense. And this is one of the things that psychoanalyst James Hillman points out, juxtaposing Eros and Thanatos in the creation of his system. And then, of course, with Jung and the archetypes and so forth. And being able to see our existence as this sort of multiplicity of drives striving against one another. And from a psychological standpoint, as individuals or even as collectives, being able to make a place for all of that that's in us, not only the sort of drives that get placed on the side of these rarefied virtues, but being able to accept that ugly, down low side of ourselves as well. And, if I'm not mistaken, this is one of the things that psychoanalysis endeavors to do is to, at least in the Jungian sense, is to actuate our process of individuation, by going through these images that are connected to these drives and unpacking them and creating meaning through them. And I'm sure the stranger has something to say about that.
Right. Across all fields of psychoanalysis, the idea of integrating the kind of bad into your narrative. Like I was just having a session with someone today, and we're talking about guilt and shame. And what did I say? Oh, basically with guilt and shame, people, the person said, well, I did something by mistake and it hurt someone. And said, okay, well, why didn't you have this second voice in your head that was like, well, I didn't mean that, so I'm not a bad person? And they were like, well, the way the other person saw me doesn't vibe with the way I see myself. They see me as someone who's mean and hurtful now. And I said, so why can't you think of yourself as mean and hurtful? Yeah. What is so intolerable about perhaps being mean once in a while? Well, then I would be bad. So why can't you be a little bad and still be good? So, the whole psychoanalytic theory is that since infancy, we're trying to project anything intolerable outside of our organic body and our minds and preserve the good object, and then over time through analysis, you realize, okay, I've got some bad stuff going on here, but it's bad and I don't have to punish myself for it. So that's like the anti-theological bit. That's what Nietzsche is about. I thought of a good metaphor, Jules. So maybe Nietzsche does hit a lot of the proto-fascist kind of check marks, but maybe he just has some of the machine parts, but not all of them. Like Nietzsche's anti-state, anti-nationalism. He's about egoism, but he's not really like a egoist individualist. But maybe he doesn't have those check marks, but maybe he's got these check marks for fascism over here.
Right.
Maybe you need a certain amount of them to qualify. So maybe he checks off some of the boxes, but not all of them. Like I'm thinking of, you look at a bunch of vehicles and they all have engines, but they're not all trucks. Some of them are motorcycles, some of them are this. So could you have some of what is fascism, but if you take the state apparatus away, what then? Maybe it's not fascist, because fascism is all about like widespread adherence to this one idea. And so I don't know the answer to that, but it's what I thought of.
Well, right. I think, I think that fascism, in as complex and evasive as defining it succinctly would be, there are different aspects to fascism. It's an ideology. It's an ideological thing. It's a economic condition. It is, a movement. It is many different things, right? So as far as having the check boxes are concerned, if we went by the Umberto Eco thing, I think he was like, no, it could be any number of these like 10 or 14 things, but like from the ideological standpoint, looking at it in like a non-materialist way, if we're just looking at it as an ideology, there is a lot of, what I could really see as inchoate fascism, whether it's the sort of concept of the overman, of like the concept of the beating down of slave morality or the elimination of slave morality, and I guess I think of slave morality as when Nietzsche is like and maybe this is saying way too far, but blaming kind of some of the shortcomings of humanity on Christianity, basically, and in that Christianity would take you, or would encourage a, poverty over things, or that would encourage the tolerance of suffering instead of, alleviating one's conditions, or to that sort of end is what I think he specifically means by, or at least how I've read the slave morality thing. So I think as far as on an ideological level, sure, there are a lot of check marks there. Now, is he a proto-fascist because he doesn't have a state behind him, or because he doesn't have a movement, or because he isn't? I just think that and obviously fascism is something that if we're talking about the economic conditions, or the ways that fascism exists in terms of economic conditions and the yielding. You could talk about the parastate operators in Reconstruction in American history that were around when Nietzsche was around too, 1865-ish or something. So I guess what I'm saying is just on an ideological level, he does check a lot of boxes, but on the material, is a fascist not a fascist because he doesn't have a state or a movement behind him? Fascism, in the ideological sense that we all know and think of, didn't really exist till the 1930s anyway. So, if we can concede that fascism isn't just a swastika that happened in 1930s, and it's a broad set of things that happens over time, and then I think we can it's easier to pin fascism or proto-fascism to Nietzsche if we think of fascism in that regard. Well,
I almost think there's a very easy knockdown argument for this.
Okay.
I would say that in one very strong sense, that fascism is the complete and almost ultimate reterritorialization of ressentiment and slave morality. And the stranger already touched on this. The question that you're bringing up is, does fascism depend on the unity of the nation, of the race, or what have you? And the answer is yes. Right? That's where it gets its strength. That's where it gets its vitality. That's where it is able to stave off the anxiety to live in the kind of quote unquote completeness that is an openness to the totality of ourselves, but not the defined totality in the sense of a nation. Not that, I should say, the totality of, or maybe the wholeness of who we are, but not the totality of what we are in the sense of totalitarianism, where we delimit the definition of who we are on the basis of national identity, or religious identity, and so forth. Think about what slave morality is. You are bad, therefore I am good. And just because I have the big weapons and I have the big guns, and I'm able to enslave you in the sort of, in the very real sense of the word, this does not mean that I'm in any way extricated from slave morality, or the idea, the projection of the other with a capital O, this negative other, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is the big mistake. And in fact, what a better way to be in the trap, to think that you're not the slave because you have that other enslaved. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think in this sense, once again, there's so many non-starters for Nietzsche on the fascist front. There's and just like the stranger said, there's a couple of things that we could check off, and that's one of the things I love about Nietzsche too, is that he doesn't fit firmly into any of the sort of political tendencies that are in our Overton window here today, right? At least in 2021. Because the Manichaeism that develops out of slave morality is inherent to almost all the major political tendencies, right? And this is why I think to rethink a politics of liberation these days involves, I think it needs Nietzsche, or somebody like Nietzsche, to have that sort of destituent power over the group and individual psychology, that which is capable of dismantling this tendency to go into these sort of firmed enclaves and, identify, with a political tendency, just on the basis of this sort of, immaterial identity. When we talk about materialism, when we talk about, the suffering of workers and those who are victimized by capitalism under the neoliberal order, right? What does that mean? It means, that there are people who, every day engage in these sort of petty disputes about political ideologies, and they're doing absolutely nothing to upend the real material conditions by which they are oppressed, which involve the state, which involve the power of corporations, capitalists, and so on, and all of the other ideological components, that make that work. Right. So I think Nietzsche would behoove all, studying Nietzsche and kind of taking him to his ultimate conclusion would be, in what way can we see ourselves? Like Nietzsche talks about individuality, but I think when you look at Deleuze and Guattari, they take Nietzsche's concepts and they develop them in such a way that they can be applied to the assemblage. Not necessarily this overarching unity of all people on planet Earth, right? But, the struggles of people do have I would say a unitary dimension, but, the lives of people and the demands, the exigencies of people in their locality do differ. And, these need to be realized in terms of those people, their lives, the will of the people with whom, they work and live every day, right? And not to be subjugated by this totalizing entity that stands above them. I think first and foremost, that's one of the things that Nietzsche wants to do. He wants to get out from those material conditions that have imposed the things that we talk about: eternal debt, guilt, and so on. Right.
And I've always jokingly said the left is afraid of power because power has been sucked up by the right. I say power, what's the first bad thing you think? You think white, maybe you think white power, right? Mm-hmm. You might not think black power first. And then there's all this like ideological warfare against black power and all that stuff. But the left is afraid of power. I like the Deleuze and Guattari connection because, let me say a little bit about Guattari. I think Guattari is a lot more like Nietzsche than people realize. I think if you read Guattari's solo works, two come to mind, like the Anti-Oedipus Papers, which is basically just a notebook of ideas, and then any of his later stuff like Lines of Flight. He writes like Nietzsche, not necessarily the language, but he writes in like fragments under a lot of subtexts or like subtitles. So like, a lot of writers will have nice flow, and Nietzsche and Guattari don't have that. They have like, here are my thoughts on this, on this, on this. They're also a little bit mad. I don't mean angry. I mean, like they're a little bit crazy. And to bring it back to the music we started with, they both were kind of failed pianists. Nietzsche has some compositions out there, and he wanted to be a musician. He loved Wagner. Guattari also played piano, and as you guys know, we see his musical aptitude come through in a lot of the concepts of like the refrain. That's a musical concept. There's so much music in 1,000 Plateaus, like who's the prepared piano guy they talk about? John Cage, of course, and music is a power for them. So interesting connections there, I think, to be made.
I was going to say liking Wagner is on the or fascism list too.
That's funny.
Well, Nietzsche had some harsh words for him in the end.
He switched it up. Yeah.
Was Nietzsche banging Wagner's wife or something like that? Did I know something about
Cosima?
that?
Was he? I thought he was an incel, basically.
Well, there's that picture of him that goes around on the internet with Lou Salome and what's the other guy's name? Ree?
Yeah.
Paul Ree, and Nietzsche's got a boner, and Salome's grabbing
I've seen that, yeah.
There was something, that was probably just like a funny photo, but he was in love with her.
She chose someone else, though, from his heart.
That's right.
Yeah, and then she went on to be a famous psychoanalyst after being analyzed by Freud and Jung, I think.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So, interesting connections.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm not finding a whole lot right here on this, but Nietzsche was 25 when he met Wagner and his 32-year-old mistress Cosima.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche, I think he died a virgin, right?
I don't know. I don't think he did.
Okay.
I heard that he didn't. And I heard that I went for years believing that the syphilis story was true, but maybe
it's false.
It's false. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, I don't know. I'm going to wager based on the picture alone that he got fondled. I mean, he definitely got fondled. All right. And I'm sure with some begging, he probably got what he wanted.
Let's just go over what we confirmed in this episode.
Yep.
Nietzsche, a proto-fascist? We don't know yet. Was he fondled? He was fondled. Yes.
Yeah.
So let me tell you guys, man, I just would bring it back to music for a moment. You guys know that that movie with like Jack Black called School of Rock or something?
Mm-hmm.
So that's an actual like school, and the guy who founded that school lived up here in Woodstock for a while, and he's moved on to other things, but the school still exists, and so it's really cool. Sometimes you're able to catch like kids out like performing like a tribute to Radiohead or to different bands, which is like, you know, really cool and exceptional. But they also have an adult program, and the adult program, when they're finishing their coursework, needs a place to play. And so they had reached out about the venue where I work, and I did sound for the School of Rock for 2 nights, the adult program. And it was a really interesting sort of thing, because it was like, you know, how many times do you get to see like a whole bunch of adults like pretty much doing like their first gig ever?
Right.
You know,
that's cool.
Yeah, it was super cool. But it was, as a sound person, it was kind of nightmarish in a way, because you know, they run on stage, they plug their cables in, right? Their amps are already on and turned up, right? So they plug their cables in, they do their song, and then as soon as the song is done, they rip their cables out and they run off stage, and other people run back on stage. There's like 12, 15 people in this band. And so they plug their cables back in, and like as a sound dude, like, you know, you're just watching for bombs dropping all night, possibly, you know, with like making sure to hit the mute group in time when the song ends, sort of stuff.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And so when this whole thing was done on Saturday night, because they played like a Friday and a Saturday, the one thing I did not plan on or foresee was that I guess they've trained these adults in the Rock Academy to sort of, as soon as they're done performing, to clear the stage, like wrap the cables up, put the instruments away, and all that stuff. So these adults, as soon as the Saturday night show was done, like all of them sort of just descended on the stage and started like grabbing stuff, and they took like house assets with them, just in the hurried process of sweeping stuff up. So I ended up having to like kind of police the outdoor with whatever they were bringing out. Like, hey, hang on, this is like our surge suppressor. This is our extension cord, you know. But it was a really wild sort of wild thing, and I just thought you guys might think some of that is pretty interesting with the, you know, folks doing their first gig ever.
Yeah. That's pretty funny. They're just snatching stuff up. This is mine now. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've made off with some stuff every now and again. Like, I'll just come home. Now I have a 30-foot XLR cable. Like, I don't know how I got in the bag. And yeah. No, that's really cool though. I've always been involved with music, but I never played like a live rock gig until I was like 25 years old. And my first show was at the Viper Room in Hollywood, and it was really cool. And we made money that night too, and we were able to buy a power amp with it. So it was a sort of a nostalgic thing. But that's where I cut my teeth. Like, I was able to get in with like a pretty decent band. You know, as soon as I, you know, wanted, like, I mean, if you go to LA, there's just going to be amazing musicians wherever you go. So, and the band in some sense was already made to order, and they became my best friends. And I'm writing music with one of the guys tomorrow. So, yeah, it's really cool to have that first gig.
It's awesome.
It's awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool. Pretty big venue, right?
The Viper Room, I mean, in terms of its reputation, yeah, but the venue itself is very intimate. It's a cool place to play. I remember that night too. They must have had a like a fashion show earlier in the day, so they had a runway that went out into the audience. So that was kind of badass. Like you got to do something on there. And so I was like, okay. I mean, I was probably very nervous, and if I heard the gig today, I'd probably be shuddering the whole time. But since then, doing other cool shows here and there. Like I don't know. Have you ever been out to LA to play a gig, stranger? I know Jules hasn't.
No, I haven't. I was invited once, but I couldn't make it work with work and school.
Yeah.
That would have been cool though. It's for a weird band. They're like, come tour with us, dude. Really? Yeah, sure.
I mean, I was playing at I don't know what the Sunset Strip is like these days. I mean, the scene was already over by the time that I got there, but I mean, it was just the whole pay to play thing. I know, is that just an LA thing, or did they do that in New York too?
There are a couple of places that are pay to play, which are really awful. Some of them run this racket where they make you sell X amount of tickets,
right,
to get paid, and there's this one venue here that is one of the larger venues, but inevitably what happens is when you get to play your opening or supporting act or something, and they make you sell X amount of tickets only, and they're gonna like cancel and reschedule further out so that everyone can sell more tickets.
Right.
It's a whole racket, man. But that's a thing in New York. It's pretty wild in the Hudson Valley, man. I think it's like it's a cool little scene that nobody talks about, because I've lived a lot of places, and some places, like if you want to do a solo thing as a solo musician and make your living playing different breweries or what have you, like there are some places in the country where you just can't do that, where there's not enough places to support that, or it's just not, that maybe the places are too spaced out. But yeah, I mean, in Ulster County, there are all sorts of breweries and restaurants and places here, and live music is a thing, and it's you can do this thing, and what I tell people to do is like follow the photographer schedules. Like there are guys that are just photographers here that go to the best gigs, know where all the gigs are happening and make the best ones and take photos and post them to social media. But if like you can follow those guys around, like you'll never see a bad show. And they're out, 5 nights a week. So it's a really cool place to live up here.
That's rad.
It's cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Out here, I mean, I don't think I have it in me anymore to ever do a pay to play gig again. But some of my most favorite gigs of all time were like over here in LA. It's not. I don't think it's here anymore. They made it into something else. But there's a place in Highland Park, or there was a place in Highland Park, in Los Angeles called Mr. T's Bowl. It was a bowling alley. And basically, I think they just refurbished the bowling alley, but they had a stage adjacent to the bowling alley. So as you're playing, you're just watching people bowl, and it had this really sort of like old vibey 60s, 70s thing going on there. And, those are some of my favorite gigs. Actually, strangely, like in a very sort of like Lynchian sort of way, my favorite gigs have been the ones where nobody has attended. It's just been the band. And I've played like really cool gigs, like Packed House. I don't know if you've ever heard that band Steel Panther. Are you familiar with them?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like on any given Monday night, 10 or 12 years ago, we opened up for them like once or twice. And
cool.
I mean, like those shows are always like pretty wild. And I remember like playing like a really good show there once, and was going back to the green room, and in the elevator it was just me and Corey Feldman. Because Corey like that's the kind of thing that like just happens in LA. Like you're sweating, you got your bag, your gear with you, and now I'm stuck, in this awkward silence in an elevator that's not moving with Corey Feldman going back to the green room.
That's too funny.
Yeah. And other weird things just at a show, getting ready to play, it looked to my left and there's Ron Jeremy just making out with somebody. Like,
wow.
where did he? And like, he's really close to me. Like, how did you get that close? But that's the thing. But then, of course, those things are just spaced out over, completely banal, non-event sort of scenarios, right? But back to, these gigs where there's this kind of, there's just this miasma of dust and heat and light and nobody in the venue. But I remember once being in Reno, Nevada, and you could barely see the audience. It was almost like a horror movie. You just saw eyes and noses poking through the shadows. And just, an hour and a half set, nobody clapping, just banter, like a little bit of banter into the nothingness. Nobody really giving any feedback, but just loving it and just how that just sticks with you for life. Like that sort of image. Another show I did once, I mean, zero people came. Zero people came to the venue. It was just us playing to the bartender. And actually, it was a cover gig for like one of these bands that I do. And it was one of the most fun shows I played in my life. The bartender was loving it. And strangely, those are the ones that kind of stick with me. Not the one where there's 1,500 people, or 2,000 people, but those.
Sometimes it just helps you let loose. Because you're like, no one's watching, who gives a shit? And you end up playing like way better than usual. And you're
totally.
Yeah.
Like the ones that stick with me, man, are the ones, I call them like the spaghetti face, man, when like you're playing to a dinner crowd and it's more just about their dinner than anything else. So you're just playing and you're trying to you're like, maybe if I channel some like real emotion, some real fucking tone through my fingers, maybe if I get, and you use that gig to like get into it and really, and you like sing this like tender, heartfelt lyric or something, and you maybe do it with your eyes closed, and then as you slowly open your eyelids, you look up and there's like just this dude with a fork full of spaghetti, like kind of with his mouth open, staring at you, like you're just like something to observe. What like you're some fucking alien, like they're just observing you while they eat their dinner. And I mean, it's playing some breweries and stuff around dinner time is like really there's some trippy, weird scenarios at times. Like we once played at this brewery that had this it's like they would put us in the section of the room that had kind of like this this wall that just went out, and we had to play in an area that was on one side of that wall where there was like an entire dining room on the other side of the wall. And so like, it's like you're playing and you don't know if anyone's listening because you can't see over the wall over there. So it's just like,
that's weird.
Yeah. Like weird stuff like that, but, anyway, so guys, this has been a lot of fun, man. We should definitely do it again sometime. Sure. I'm sorry that, well, not sorry, but like I thank you for entertaining my like one or two red lines and problematizing of Nietzsche for this stuff, because I know you guys are way more familiar with his work than I probably am, and so I appreciate being able to bounce ideas off of you guys that way.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. I think Nietzsche would have approved. He's all about like friendly conflict, friendly conversation, so I thought it was good. He made some good points, and it was a good just conversation for us to talk about what's cool about Nietzsche and what maybe isn't. So,
yeah, says the guy in the Nietzsche t-shirt.
Yeah, yeah.
Which,
Craig,
by the way,
do you have any last thoughts? Yep.
Well, I was going to say, speaking of Nietzsche t-shirts, Jules, I was going to offer you one, so I want to hear which t-shirt from the. Oh, by the way, stranger, did you get the shirt that I sent you?
I don't think I ever.
Oh, you didn't? Yeah, that you never settled on one, right?
I still need to do that, and I still will do that. I look through the whole. There's just too many good ones. I have to pick.
It's an embarrassment of riches.
It's the Schopenhauer one that I really want, man.
I actually did a new Nietzsche t-shirt too. So actually, I did an Amor Fati t-shirt today that you should check out.
Cool.
Yeah, that's on there. So. I'm not here to plug my t-shirt store, but both of you guys are entitled to one.
Says the guy sitting there with a t-shirt cannon.
Yeah,
that's right.
That's cool. No, that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So just let me know, and then I'll hook you guys up.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, so we'll let you go now. This is going to be on the Patreon for listeners, and thank you guys so much for your support. And we will have these guys on again, and we'll probably talk about more philosophy in a very in a way that is kind of off tilt and not really presented well by me. And we'll have more discussions around all that. So awesome.